Thanks, Manu. And just to clarify, I'm sure you've picked up that Manu left the State Department just a couple weeks ago, January 20th, roughly. And as it says in the, hopefully everybody picked up, there's a handout with bios. He's joining MasterCard as a vice president in MasterCard's Center for Inclusive Growth. There's still, for folks in the back, there's still scattered seats around. So, don't be shy to come up and just, sit anywhere. It's at least 10 seats. And I also just want to, so we're starting this session on local approaches to advancing global connect and getting to at least this goal of 1.5 billion. Although in titling this event, we're even more optimistic of trying to think about the next 3 billion, because as you get deeper and deeper into the emerging markets, it gets harder and harder. So we want to think about the global approaches, which will be our second session after lunch. So I'm going to introduce the moderator, but one thing I want to mention so that you all can be thinking about this during this session is at the end where we normally say, ask the audience, for questions of the panelists. If you can also think about it, and this was Megan Smith's idea, offers and asks. So I know many of you are directly involved in this world, or could be. You have resources. So think about what you could, and you don't have to sign in a dotted line today, but think about what you could offer to this effort, to any of these folks, either who are speaking or others who are here, or if you're in this world and you have asks, what would they be? Like, what do you, badly need to make things happen? Because we've heard sad stories about connectivity that just was right on the edge, but didn't happen because something was missing, a fiber connection or permission to do this, or a changed regulation. So Kim Hart will moderate. We have 4 presentations, 5 to 10 minutes, and then a panel discussion and your asks and offers at the end. Kim has a new position at a new publication. I think most of you know who she is. She's technology editor at Axios, which is new, and she came also very recently, left the FCC, where she was the press secretary to the chairman, Tom Wheeler. Kim?
So I'll introduce our panelists today, and then they'll each come up and give their presentations, and once they've concluded that, we'll come back on stage and have a discussion and hear from you guys as well. First, we'll hear from Steve Song. He's a senior research associate of the Network Startup Research Center. And then Vanu Bose, he's president and CEO of Vanu Inc. Christopher Yu, he's the founding director of One World Connected and also professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And Dave Wright, he's the director of regulatory affairs and network standards at Ruckus Wireless. So I believe we'll start with Steve.
So I'm from the Network Startup Resource Center, an organization that builds the capacity of engineers to build internet networks around the world. And my remarks this morning are going to be confined largely to sub-Saharan Africa, which is my geographic area of expertise. Now, if I were to tell you that mobile technologies have transformed the world, particularly in the global south, I'm sure some eyes would roll up in the audience, sort of tell me something new. But I think what's interesting about mobile technologies is how long it took for their impact to be recognized. The first mobile networks in sub-Saharan Africa were rolled out, I think the first was in South Africa in 1994. But it wasn't until more than 10 years later that the publications like The Economist began to recognize just that the social and economic transformative potential of this technology. And what I want to suggest to you this morning is that, in fact, there's another technology that is going to have a similar kind of tectonic impact on access, and that is fiber optic infrastructure. Only 8 years ago, the first high-capacity undersea cable found its way down the east coast of Africa, the Seacom cable, followed within a very short time by more than a dozen undersea cables, with more than 6 new cables planned in the next couple of years. That investment has spurred a massive, triggered investment in terrestrial infrastructure to the point where there is hardly a country on the continent that doesn't have a national terrestrial fiber backbone. And the impact of that is to put tremendous pressure on the end of that bridge. And it's unlocked potential for all kinds of new access approaches. Fiber to the home in urban centers, but most importantly, opening up wireless access. And that, in turn, has put tremendous pressure on regulators who control access to that wireless spectrum in order to take advantage of this massive potential. Fiber optic infrastructure is the deepwater port of the internet. When you're on fiber, you're only milliseconds away from the living, beating heart of the internet. So this is new, and somehow we need to unlock this potential by unlocking wireless access. But unfortunately, the traditional models for unlocking wireless spectrum aren't really working that well in the global south, because spectrum auctions, which may generate millions or billions of dollars in costs for operators, those costs are borne by those operators and are ultimately passed on to consumers. And if we're talking about access of ARPUs of less than $3, this actually may not be the best model. In addition, regulators are struggling because the pace of change of technology now is completely eclipsing their ability to regulate effectively. And the best illustration of this that I know of is in 2006, an agreement among African countries to engage in the digital switchover, the move from analog terrestrial broadcasting to digital terrestrial broadcasting, a move that entirely made sense at the time in 2006, and they planned for 2015 for it to be complete. Well, we're in 2017 now, and less than half of the countries that committed to this transition have completed it. And that's not new. That's fairly normal. Spectrum, refarming and that sort of thing takes that sort of time. But what's interesting is the things that didn't exist in 2006. This device didn't exist in 2006, the smartphone. Streaming media in its current form didn't exist in 2006. Tablets, and in fact, the interesting confluence of tablets, phones, and streaming media. So an entire industry of broadcast, has come into a multi-million-dollar industry in the time of this process. So clearly, we need to do something different. And I think what regulators need to do now is to diversify their approaches to access to decrease their risk and increase the opportunities for access to flourish. So embracing unlicensed spectrum, embracing dynamic spectrum, such as TV widespec technologies that can create massive upside potential with very, very low risk for regulators. And indeed, setting aside spectrum for rural access that can also make way for new technologies. So just talking about Wi-Fi for a minute, this is an old chart. This is from 2012, and it was pretty cool then because it showed that over 80% of mobile data traffic actually travels over Wi-Fi networks, not over mobile networks. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, yes, but that's Europe, that's North America, this is not really relevant. Well, let me show you news from 2016 in sub-Saharan Africa. The Seychelles, an ISP is committed to making Seychelles a Wi-Fi nation. This is Rock Telecom in Kampala, partnering with Google's Project Link, their fiber project there. They have rolled out in the last 2 years over 500 hotspots. They sell a coupon, it's called a Rock Spot. It's 1,000 shillings for 24 hours of unlimited access. 1,000 shillings is 27 cents. The government of Kenya is committed to rolling out Wi-Fi across its counties. Project Isizwe in Shwani in South Africa has rolled out vast amounts of Wi-Fi infrastructure in both townships and urban centers alike. Similarly in Johannesburg, this is Bofinet in Botswana. that the fiber operator there that is committed to Wi-Fi rollouts domestically. Kenya, libraries are offering free access to Wi-Fi. This is a new startup in Kenya that is covering the entirety of the township of Kibera with Wi-Fi access at similar kinds of prices. Not just governments and businesses, gas stations, city buses in Cape Town offering Wi-Fi. So, and the reason this is happening is because it can. This relatively permissionless technology, Wi-Fi, combined with its extremely low cost, when you combine that with the vast capacity that you get from fiber optic infrastructure, it's like, peanut butter and chocolate, it's two great tastes that go together. But it's not limited to that. The same kind of innovations in manufacturing and technology is actually opening up innovation elsewhere. So the same kinds of technology are now enabling GSM base stations that cost tens of thousands of dollars instead of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And these are just a few of the companies, and you'll hear more about that later. The challenge here is that it's not unlicensed. They're working with licensed spectrum, and this innovation that's happening here is thwarted by the fact that it's very, very hard for these companies to actually get started in countries where there's no access to spectrum. Happily, there is one sterling example here in Mexico where the regulator gave an experimental license to an NGO in Oaxaca who began to roll out low-cost GSM base stations, which so impressed the regulator that they created a 10 megahertz set-aside of spectrum for rural access. And simple things like that can unlock potential for delivering rural access. But I've talked too much, I think, about technology, that all of this technology is not really going to go anywhere without the local capacity to build it. So alongside of enabling regulation, we also need massive investment in building the engineers of tomorrow, in building that generation of people who are going to grab hold of that technology, whether it's white space or Wi-Fi or low-cost GSM, and build out these networks. Because now we live in the world where it's within the power of entrepreneurs, of communities, municipalities to determine their own connectivity. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. It turns out to be a great lead-in to what I'm going to talk about. I think everyone here has probably been to a conference or a discussion about connecting the next billion, connecting the last billion, connecting 3 billion. So I'm going to start by trying to answer the question of why they're still unconnected today. All right, which button's which here? There we go. So you can understand, and as Steve said, wireless has been the dominant way of connecting new people to the internet, but it's kind of hit its limit and stalled. And you can understand why by looking at the unit economics of how traditional cell sites are built. In a rural area, you generally have lower population density, so you have lower people per cell site, and their average revenue per month is much lower. In the areas we're working in Rwanda, it's $1 a month. But it gets even worse, because these are typically off-grid areas. So a cell site has to run on diesel, and a typical cell site's about 4 kilowatts. So you can spend $4,000 a month on diesel fuel while your smaller number of subscribers are spending $1 a month, and it just doesn't pencil. So, it's a rational economic decision for the carriers not to build there. And the message, if one message you leave here today, I want to emphasize that the problem is not capital, not CapEx, it's OpEx. So if your revenue is less than your expenses, you don't make money. There's no ROI, it's infinite.
Economics 101.
Yeah, but look at how a lot of governments and philanthropic organizations try to help this problem. USF funds will say, I'm going to build 300 cell sites in rural Zambia, one example I know about, and give them to the operators. And they say, you got a free network. And they'll say, thank you, but no thank you, because the day I turn it on, I start losing money. So the challenge that we've taken on is how do you flip that OpEx equation around so that these sites can make money? Then we can talk about what the ROI is on the capital. And we've achieved this by combining, by combining technology and business model innovation in 3 ways. First was we had to get off diesel. right? It's expensive. It's also the highest theft item at sites, which increases your security costs. And it's an environmental disaster. In fact, there's a nice study done in rural Africa that showed you burn more diesel bringing diesel to a rural African site than you do at the site. So the environmental impact is 2x. So people have tried to build large solar fields, large battery fields to support cell sites. But at 4 kilowatts, it's just not practical or cost effective. We took a different approach. We said we're going to re-engineer everything at the cell site with the goal of minimizing power. Our entire cell site takes 90 watts of power. Now 90 watts, it's a light bulb. You can run off solar and battery. And you know, at 90 watts, you don't need a whole lot of battery to go 24 hours without sun. So the whole thing becomes much more cost effective. So we got rid of the big cost of diesel. Number 2 was the traditional model is every carrier builds their own network. Well, if everyone has to build their own network in rural, nobody's going to amortize it. So we created a wholesale model where we build and run a whole cellular network, including a switch, but we have no subscribers. We strike deals with the carriers, so when their subscribers come onto our network, they pay us a few pennies for every minute or megabyte they use. And the carriers have no cost in building or running that network. Now, when I say created, we actually, so to strike an agreement with a carrier, you have to be a GSMA carrier member. We didn't qualify. We didn't have subscribers. We didn't have spectrum. To their credit, we worked with GSMA. They created a new carrier class for wholesale so we could become members and strike agreements with carriers. Wholesale not only has the advantage of one network for multiple subscriber bases, but you've eliminated all the retail costs of the business. We don't have stores, phone subsidies, support, so you can run a very, very streamlined business. Now, the third piece is my favorite because I think it's a global demographic that's true everywhere. We've looked at it in the rural US and Africa and India. In rural areas, people tend to live in small towns or villages or otherwise within a couple kilometers of some road. That's not a highway, it's not even a paved road where we're building in Rwanda. It's a dirt road, you might call it more of a path, but everybody needs access. So we realized, wait, if we cover the roads in 2 kilometers on either side of the road, we're gonna cover all the places that people live, work, and commute, and that's what you really care about. Then when I realized, wait a minute, we only wanna go 2 kilometers from a cell site. I don't need a 300-foot tower with the 4 kilowatts of power. I can do something that most of the people in the industry still think is crazy. I can cover rural with small cells. Carriers think of small cells as urban infill and in-building, and rural as big boomer cells. And we flipped it around and said, no, I'm trying to cover these 2-kilometer radiuses so I can do it with small cells. I need less land. My tower is less reinforced because it's not as high. Nice thing about wireless, to double your distance, you have to square the energy. We win by the square root by shrinking it, so we reduce power that way. It's a complete win. You combine these 3 things, solar, wholesale, and small cell, and our economics are 10x better. And we are building a network now in Rwanda where the ARPU is $1, and we believe we can be profitable there. So one comment about the market and the people there. So if you look at this demographic of how many people own smartphones, how many have 2G phones, how many don't have a phone, the dominant in these areas is 2G phones. And this is overall. I guarantee you all those smartphones are in the big cities. And so the people there have 2G phones. So we're all talking about building the information superhighway, whether it's Wi-Fi or 4G or some form of rating internet down from the sky. But what we're very focused on, we have to connect the devices that people have today. And their first experience with the internet is going to be on a 2G cell phone. And if that's not good or useful, we may not step them up to the information superhighway. It'll be a harder path. So 2G networks are the on-ramp to this information superhighway, and we have to build that well and make it work for people to enable them to move up. Now, I know we're talking about global here. I want to emphasize America is part of the globe. And thanks to Kim's former boss, we have some great statistics about rural America. There are 23 million people in rural America without broadband today. The second stat is the most disturbing. 47% of the nation's students lack the FCC broadband requirement. In case you can't do math this early in the morning, that's less than 100 kilobits per student. 47% of the students in the country. So our first network that we built was actually in rural Vermont in areas where there's no connectivity. And one success is, as you see, we have 9 carriers using the network. both US and Canadian. So there's parts of 9 subscriber bases amortizing that cost of that one network. The reason I want to bring this up is A, it's a problem, but I find this one much harder than our Africa work. There's not as much social, there are $1 billion social impact funds trying to do stuff in Africa. Much, much less in the rural US. Same problem. And as Megan mentioned, we're having this divide between the needed and the not needed. That's only bigger unless we fix this problem. And we need to fix this problem to bring people together and improve people. So reason I put this slide in, it was our first prototype network that validated all the concepts, but it's important and we have to focus on it as well. A couple data points for you. Now, I put them on telephone poles in Vermont. My total capital per pole installed, $12K. My monthly operational cost, because we use creative backhaul and low energy, is $135 a month. At $135 a month, I ought to be able to make money. And anyone who's interested, happy to talk to you more about this afterwards. Now, this is a really big effort. So we needed to build one of these in Africa to prove the model, because with our 3 aspects, which are totally different than networks are built, it was really hard to raise private capital. So we got someone to fund a network in Rwanda for the purpose of, I said, look, if I can prove the economics, we can expand across Africa and India and cover those 1 billion people. We're very happy to say our network went live 2 weeks ago. Our first carrier on board is Airtel. We are building, by the end of the year, we will finish 376 small cell sites in rural Rwanda, covering 1 million people who have no connectivity today, where the ARPU is $1. And we think, fingers crossed, that the network can be profitable, and then we can move up. And what we're doing is we're doing 2G and Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi is free with advertising. I consider the Wi-Fi an experiment. Based on our anecdotal knowledge, I don't think there's that many Wi-Fi devices there. So what we want to do there is learn what is it that gets people to start using it, to deploying devices, to move up from the phone, or buy a phone that has GSM and Wi-Fi in it. It's a real learning opportunity. There's an opportunity to do a great study. We've got 1 million people who have no connectivity today that will have it by the end of the year. We can figure out why. So in summary, we have a model which we think can be profitable down to community sizes of a few hundred people at $1 ARPU. That's a picture of our site in Rwanda. It's a 3 by 5 meter plot of land with a 10-meter pole. We are already, based on what we've done, starting to expand and examine other countries: Ghana, Sierra Leone, Uganda, Kenya, and we just incorporated an entity for this business in India. India is a different kind of animal. So as soon as we started doing this, the government handed us a list of 40,000 villages they know with no connectivity, not even phone line, with 1,000 to 2,000 people each. So that's a nice start of 40 to 80 million people. It's a completely different scale. Thank you.
Well, thank you to New America and Michael for making this all possible. I'm here to talk to you about an initiative we're doing called One World Connected, which is something that I never get tired of talking about. First, I should acknowledge that, in fact, what we are doing owes a great debt to the great work that Steve and Vanu and all the wonderful Dave and all the other people who are doing things in the world, because we're actually coming into this at a slightly different place, and I'm happy to share with you what we're doing. So the problem has been laid out pretty well. About half the world, 3+ billion, are not online. Adoption rates are slowing. Adoption rates are slowing in Asia and in Africa in particular, where the need is the greatest. This is a problem. Governments, businesses, many of the nonprofit organizations and technical community doing a lot of great things. The problem is no one is collecting data about this systematic. No one's cataloging them to know what is going on. And the other problem is no one's actually collecting data to validate what's actually working. And there's a tendency, there's an interesting bias in this, to the extent to which there is reported information, they tend to talk about success stories. No one is systematically cataloging all of them to find out what the failure stories are and to find out proportionally what's actually working. And so, in fact, this is where we see a tremendous advantage for a need for people to fill a gap. And that's where One World Connected comes in. And in many ways, I'm very dependent on what the work that people doing this on the ground are doing. This is where a university-based research project can really do some good. We actually can synthesize across different projects. We're not doing the actual work, but we can actually use academic standards. Where appropriate, we can sign confidentiality agreements. And I also have students. The work we're doing is extremely labor-intensive, and as data collection always is. But the advantage is this is a fantastic learning opportunity for fairly young people who will become very energized and very animated by the project. So what are we doing? We've embarked on a 3-year research project to identify every innovative method to connect people to the internet that we can find. At this point, we've identified 600 case studies, and one of the we've asked about. We've been given open at the end of this talk to ask what we can do. One of the things we need is the help of the community to identify even more. Sort of a two-edged sword from our standpoint, which is we're creating more work for ourselves, but this is the kind of work we're really eager to do. To emphasize that we are looking at both supply-side and demand-side case studies. I'll give you examples of both. What we've learned is, yes, availability and cost are issues, but in Brazil, China, India, and actually US and the EU, we're discovering that the biggest issues are more about the relevance and the digital literacy issues. In other words, you could build great networks, you could make them cheap, but unless we solve the relevance and digital literacy issues, if you build it, they won't come. And in fact, what we're doing is then we're going to actually try to synthesize these and to turn this massive, well, people have told me just the catalog itself is already proving extremely useful to people doing work. They can find out in Rwanda who is doing what, and this becomes a major important step. The key for us is to actually develop a consistent set of metrics that can be applicable across all projects to talk about cost effectiveness. And part of it's just connectivity and cost, but part of it also is quality of connectivity. What kind of bandwidth will the technology support? And for us, the key question that both Steve and Vanu have already hinted at, sustainability and scalability are critical. Because there's a lot of efforts being funded by USO funding, by corporate social responsibility funding. That's important, that's helpful. It's not going to get us to $3 billion. And so we are actually looking for the underlying OpEx business models to try to find out what's going to actually work and what's going to scale. The kicker that we're really working on now, and this is those who've heard this talk before, is we are actually deep into the process of validating the data we're putting out. We've got a model survey instrument which we're now running by people and dummying up. But the key for us is to turn it not just in connectivity for its own sake, but to turn it into outcome metrics in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of economic growth. And this is where we're having to tie in with not just the communications ministers and the connectivity and internet community. These are problems that have been facing the development community generally, and to try to understand what metrics we can get on healthcare. For example, the most prevalent metrics we have are maternal mortality and infant mortality. And we need these at the community level because we're really collecting data not at the national level, but at the project-by-project level. We have to validate how, in fact, the connection between those measures which we can see to make sure we're not the person looking for their keys under the light post because that's where the light is, but actually make sure we understand how they tie into things we care about and what the time scale for measurement, and to try to figure out all these things. And then the last step is to really engage this key stakeholders. Part of it's going to be ministries who want to build this, but as Anne-Marie said at the beginning, we found that the international finance community, the development banks, and other people have a tremendous need for information, not just for what works, but they want to know the marginal impact of an additional investment dollar because they have to calibrate across a lot of different needs to make the necessary trade-offs. So this is the big part of it. The best part of this to me, and this is what I really enjoy talking about, is let's give you a few examples. So one example of a demand-side case study is Intel Chibo Connect. My apologies for the way it's displaying. This is an attempt to actually close the gender access gap through digital literacy training. They actually have deployed this not just in teaching centers, but also they have modules so you can do it by hand in your own devices to the extent to which that's possible. One of the things we're doing, we talk about digital literacy training. When you scratch on this, you find that digital literacy training comes in a lot of flavors. There's a lot of different aspects, and to find out which ones are actually working is helpful. What's fascinating to me is they're actually doing it not just as training, but they're creating tools so they can maintain networks after their training, and in terms of building this demand-side community building and capacity building so that entrepreneurs can talk with other entrepreneurs after they've been trained to develop those kinds of connections. And what we found is that right now this initiative has trained 150,000 women, and in fact that there's a wonderful video online that I'm happy to share with you where a woman tells her personal story about how she's created in the local marketplace an entrepreneurial business of hair braiding celebrating, set it next to her mother's agricultural stand, and it's really been a lovely development that has yielded tremendous benefits already in country. There's a community that often doesn't get talked about. That's a refugee community, and in Europe, this is an acute problem. They have an enormous problem because you can't buy SIM cards if you don't have an address, and refugees don't have addresses. And in fact, there's enormous problems that they're having getting these people on. Through private donations, there's an initiative going on to attach people at rate-limited basic connectivity, 50 kilobits per second, to these refugee communities using open source technologies, hacked Raspberry Pi with open source information, and also they've put the cases together. They've actually put 3D printing and other aspects available publicly, so if people want to replicate it, it's all done on an open basis. What's fascinating is this has been tremendously successful in allowing this minimal community to really get online. There's actually a wonderful picture I saw where which was proprietary, I couldn't get a hold of it. There were all these refugees, they were lying on the backs up against a hurricane fence, which they couldn't get out of, and they're all huddled in one corner because that's where they could get access, and they're all on devices, because that's their connectivity to the world, because their ability to communicate and their ability to move is so constrained. They're actually talking about expanding this to other countries, and it's a wonderful, wonderful story. Another story we ran across is in Vanuatu. There's an island. We think of Vanuatu as a main island. There is some remote islands that are 2 days travel from the nearest healthcare and the nearest hospitals. And in fact, they have no connectivity whatsoever. A Peace Corps worker has been there 3 years, actually created from scratch a community-based network to attach her island, committing most of the bandwidth to use a telemedicine center for remote diagnosis, so you actually find out when you need to travel 2 days to the relevant hospitals to make that possible. And in fact, if you want to know how this really works, they are piggybacking on satellite connectivity that's normally allocated to the Emperor of Japan, who does not require all of that, and they got permission to use it. Their biggest problem is when the Emperor of Japan travels out of country, they lose the connectivity because they shut it down because it's not needed for its primary purpose. But it's a fascinating little story. And in fact, this has been wonderfully brought, the whole cost $6,000 US, brought healthcare real incomes impacts to a small community, and that in fact this is a good example where they were actually able to change policy to make it work. They needed to convince the regulator to turn part of the 900 megahertz unlicensed spectrum and make it available for community networking. It's fascinating. When we spoke with this woman at the IGF, she actually remote dialed in. We were in contact with her. She frankly said after 3 years she was losing energy, and just as she'd been laboring, and just by connecting to a community outside, she found it revitalizing and she found it inspiring. And I was really humbled by that, because I said, it's not us who's inspiring you, it's the other way around. So these are just a few of the examples we're giving. We've 30 up on our website already. As Vanu said, we have US-based case studies. Actually, they're wonderful because we get better data, frankly, and often longitudinal data. But for the challenges that Steve and other people have identified, in the US, the problem is not lack of technical expertise, it's not lack of capital, and not functioning capital markets. It's just some of these areas just are hard to serve. We have another project, we have projects in Europe, Scottish Highlands, very hard to serve, just very hyper-rural, and these are fantastic opportunities to look at. I'm happy to talk to you more about them as we go. The Ask, we have a mailing list that's through a dynamic coalition through the Internet Governance Forum. We invite you to join it. We really would invite you to give us any data you have or identify more case studies. That is something we'd like to crowdsource, and there is a crowdsource tool on the webpage. We really need the help developing the metrics, in the sense that if you know people who have experience in the development communities working these up, we're in the process of working our way through them, but finding other people who are really willing to partner with us. We have a lot of conversations, but few people identified to help it grow. Something I forgot to put on here, we're actually looking for more research staff. We're looking at hiring at least 2 more young sort of researchers who are going to pound their way through the case studies and the interviews to make it happen, and we're looking for a communications person, because we're going to spin out blog posts about everything that we can find. And then lastly, there's a bunch of social media options for how to spread this around. This is really a venture that a lot of people supported. We're very grateful for Manu's involvement. He mentions IEEE, World Bank, World Economic Forum, People-Centered Internet have been all fantastically supportive, and we really would welcome this is the kind of thing that's really going to take the contributions for all the people who are making it on the ground, and so we'd welcome any input you'd have. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Michael, for the invitation to participate. It's refreshing for me to be up here today talking with you about this topic. In my position, I often am talking about technology policy or spectrum policy in a little bit more of an abstract setting. So looking at how it's impacting people's lives around the world is really quite exhilarating for me. So glad to be here with you. Let's see, my slide is there. So I'm here today to talk to you about one organization, quite terrific organization actually, that's tackling this challenge in South Africa. That organization is Project Axios. And Project Axios has a mission of connecting people across South Africa to the internet, specifically with a focus on providing that connectivity for the purposes of education and employment. And Ruckus's role in that is we're one of their key technology providers. We provide the Wi-Fi access network for Project Axios. So we're quite honored to partner with them in that way. And if you don't know, which I'm going to be surprised if too many of you do know, Axios is a Xhosa word, and it means tribe, people, or nation, which is really quite appropriate because what they're seeking to do is to build and then strengthen community via connectivity by bringing people online. So looking a little bit at just the situation in South Africa, I know we're looking to bring 1.5 or as a stretch goal 3 billion people online. I think that's fabulous. About 35 million of those people are in South Africa. And I would say they've made great strides over the last couple of decades in terms of bringing basic rights for each citizen to a base level allocation for electricity and water. But the truth of the matter is that internet connectivity remains out of reach of most of these people. As I think Vanu and Steve both alluded to in their presentations, and Manu earlier, the economics of the traditional cellular industry just really don't meet the needs of these folks. So one calculation is that for about a gigabit cellular data plan, you'd be looking at 12 to 15% of the disposable income at the minimum wage, which is where a good portion of these people are operating. So I think somebody earlier said that in the developed world, that's maybe 2 to 3% disposable. Here we're talking 12 to 15, which is just totally out of reach. As an aside, I don't have a slide on this, but as people have been talking, it occurs to me that one of the things, I know Steve mentioned this, just the traditional licensed spectrum auction model is one of the reasons that the cellular economics, the traditional cellular economics, don't necessarily work here. I think we should be looking at what the FCC has done with the Citizens Broadband Radio Service in the US. I know we've talked about TV white spaces. CBRS is another new spectrum regime that's obviously starting here, starting to be looked at by regulators in other geographies now as well. And CBRS opens up more cellular-oriented spectrum. So in the US, it'll be the 3.5 gigahertz band. But it's opening that up for opportunistic use, a little bit more akin to what we've done with Wi-Fi. I think the commissioners took a really progressive stance there and started to try to blur the distinctions between licensed and unlicensed spectrum. So white spaces certainly is going to be very important in getting these people online. I think that the opportunistic use of cellular-oriented spectrum may be another good way to do that. CBRS also supports the wholesale model that Vanu was talking about. So a neutral host provider can build a network, and then different mobile operators can sort of bring their subscribers onto that footprint. And the economics just become much more viable in the developing world. So that's sort of some of the reality in South Africa, 35 million people. I mentioned that Project Axios has a real focus on education and employment. So, I'm sure we all, many of us have school-age kids. I've got 3, and the internet is just part and parcel of what they do. All the homework assignments are submitted that way. We get their grades that way. When I don't know how to help them with their homework, I Google it. I mean, it's just part of educating kids these days. So unfortunately, in South Africa, for many of the children, this is their reality of what the educational experience is like. And it's sort of dialing the clock back, 2 or 3 decades, in my opinion. Many of us probably did walk to school, but lack of textbooks, certainly lack of access to online content, just the ability to educate yourself online these days. I mean, this isn't just a K through 12 education issue. I mean, this is sort of a lifelong education issue in my mind. If I can't figure out how to do something around the house or on one of my cars, the first thing I do is go on YouTube and do a search, and usually I can find somebody who's taken the time to record a video on how to do that. These people don't have that opportunity. So this is education. For employment, same thing. It's dialing the clock back a couple of decades. Imagine what it was like when you applied for your last job. If it was any time, again, in the last couple of decades, it probably involved email communication, doing your research online, submitting your resume or CV that way, perhaps doing conference calls or teleconferences, even for interviews. And what about just researching the organization that you're applying to? So, all of that goes away if you don't have internet connectivity, which is where these folks are. So what's Project Axios doing about this? They have a goal that every citizen should be within walking distance of free Wi-Fi. Steve mentioned them during his overview of some of the projects in Africa. And so they started in the city of Tshwane, which is in the Gauteng province. They've now taken the model to actually over 8 provinces in South Africa, so it's expanding rapidly. They started in a 2013 timeframe, and in that 3 years, they've built out now over 1,000 what they call free internet zones. And these are typically in conjunction with an educational institution or a community center. They'll put up a Wi-Fi access point and then the backhaul assets to it. Typically fiber. They've got some infrastructure partners that they're working with who are providing the fiber and the bandwidth on that. I think Steve made a very pertinent point about the fiber build out that has happened across Africa as those undersea cables have gone around the continent. And there is a good amount of fiber capacity that's available, so they've tapped into that with some of their partners. We're also working with like Liquid Telecom, who's doing fiber throughout Kenya and a few other countries in Africa as well. So the model is that this is free internet. It started out at 250 megabyte limit per device per day. They've upped that now recently to 500 megabytes. And it's rate limited to 15 megabits downlink and then a megabit on the uplink. That 500 megabyte cap, though, is waived for what's considered local community generated content. So they have actually television programming that they're now distributing across the network. That's not counted against this rate cap, nor is educational or other locally generated content. So the 500 is really more sort of general internet usage. The 2.6 million unique users, so again, in about 3 years' time, of that 35 million unconnected people in South Africa, they've been able to touch 2.6 million people. So I'm really encouraged by the progress that they have made. I won't worry about sessions, but then the other statistic that I think is worth noting is this 3.6 petabytes of traffic that has been carried over the network. So for those of you, I did the conversion here, so that's 3.6 million gigabytes. Again, if a gigabyte cellular data plan is consuming roughly 12 to 15% of somebody's income at the minimum wage, think of the people who've been able to connect to this and get on the internet for the first time in many cases, who never would have had that opportunity without this. And Banu, I'm going to be very curious to see what you find in Rwanda with the Wi-Fi service that you're providing. I have a feeling people will come out of the woodwork, so to speak, with devices there. So yeah, that'll be good. It does take a coalition, I think, as Megan talked about earlier. with the World War II shipbuilding examples, when you had people rallying from all different sectors to make that happen and creating some amazing results. That's the same thing here. So at the heart of this, you've got Project Axios, which is a nonprofit, but then you've got close cooperation from government, specifically at the municipal level, although they're now also working at the regional and national levels. And then the infrastructure providers. So this wouldn't really work economically without some participation from Neotel and a couple of other bandwidth providers that they're working with. So it's really the confluence of those interests coming together that have made this happen. And they're looking at different models now. So Shawane was initially fully funded by the government for a 3-year period. There's been a change of administration at the municipal level, and they're starting to look at ways of potentially adapting that going forward. So one thought is they'll continue to be the basic 500 megabyte allocation per every citizen, but if people want to go above that, they may do like an ad-sponsored model. I think somebody mentioned that earlier. So there may be some corporate sponsors who would then give the citizen a right to consume data above the cap. So see how that evolves. I appreciated Chris's point about we need some ways to quantify what success means here and what those metrics ought to be, and I think that's really admirable work, and I look forward to seeing some of that, not just to know what the successes are, but also where we are messing up and where we need to course correct. However, I also really enjoy the personal success stories that I see. So, with the Axios, they have just a catalog of the lives that they have impacted. And these are entrepreneurs, they're students, they're folks producing music and posting it up on YouTube, and just people who are engaging in the online community, both in South Africa and in the global online community for the first time, who wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So I find these really encouraging. It makes me, feel good about what it is that we're doing here. So thank you. I would highly encourage you to go to the Project Axios website. There's a lot of information, some videos, and again, you can look through those testimonials. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for the presentation. I know we're running a little bit behind, so we'll take 15 minutes or so to chat up here, and then we'll open it up to questions as well as offers and suggestions from the audience. A couple of you, maybe all of you, mentioned the success stories that you're trying to measure from this. And Chris and Vanu, we were talking backstage about one of the problems that you're all running into is it's easy in some ways to measure the connectivity and the success you're having that way. But it's harder to measure the impact that that connectivity is having on secondary effects such as healthcare, education, employment. And it's been very hard for you to find best practices for that, or people who have the expertise to be able to provide that kind of service for you as you guys are providing the technical backend and financial services. So what are some of the ways forward on that to help demonstrate the importance of these projects through their success?
So I'm happy to start. It's
Sure.
One of the most, oddly enough, the most interesting focusing device has been the global commitment by countries to the Sustainable Development Goals that has activated countries at the highest levels of leadership to bring in other ministries that used to be thought of just as a communications ministry issue. And that has brought in healthcare ministries who've been studying issues such as turning the real outcome metrics into usable information for a very long time and bringing them into the internet connectivity debate. And so what we're finding is that focus, the gender equality issues, the education issues, all these things down the line of the SDGs, have activated communities that didn't think that they had any connection to broadband, and they're now here now. And they've been doing this for a long time, and they do it better than we do, frankly, and we need to tap into that.
And Steve, you have something?
Yeah, interesting. I think there's a broad assumption that there's great data on connectivity, but It's not actually true. We have been doing some work recently, supported by USAID's Global Development Lab through FHI 360, looking at financing the last mile and looking at market assessments. And actually finding out what coverage looks like turns out to be quite challenging, because the data is all provided by the operators. And the coverage maps they provide, well, it's
Marketing.
let's just say they're aspirational. So, for instance, in Uganda, the maps supplied to by the operators to the GSMA indicate that there's greater than 97% 2G coverage. Now, in independent study done by consultants contracted by the regulator there, looking at tower coverage based on towers, suggests 81% coverage. And that amounts to a difference of nearly 6 million people. So validating that data becomes tremendously important. And I would argue that not only do we need good evaluation data, we actually need better raw data on connectivity, because when we talk about connecting everyone, then this data becomes absolutely critical.
And all of your projects have a large component of wireless in the way of getting to people who are hard to reach, who are very rural. They're in small villages and towns that are not easily reached in a lot of cases, other than a path or so. Wireless can get the service so far, but doesn't fiber have to be a big component of getting that service to the point where wireless can then be provided to serve the last mile? And where is that fiber going to come from? Where is that build out coming from, which is really the big CapEx?
As Steve mentioned, a lot of it is already there, at least in the urban areas and outside of it a little bit. So I can give you the examples from our two networks. So in Rwanda, they did a pretty good job of the urban areas, and all the national highways have fiber along them. So when we're in a remote area, maybe I have to go 50 or 100 miles through a wireless microwave link to where I can get to fiber. But that's okay. That's a viable solution, provided there aren't monopoly rents on the towers. And another example is in Vermont. They had a broadband stimulus fiber build, and it's tough terrain, valleys and mountains, but we can go wireless hops down the road until we hit a fiber point. And that's much better connectivity and much more cost effective than any other ways. So fiber doesn't have to be everywhere. It has to be within viable reach of a wireless last mile hop or middle mile hop.
And in fact, they've actually, the default backfill for a lot of this is satellite backhaul, which is what you need to get the really remote areas to connect them on. It's not optimal. But one of the funny things is, people will say, oh, that doesn't work. Or in the US debate, we have a huge problem where people will say wireless, oh, it's fixed line or nothing, wireless doesn't count. This is where I think data helps a lot, which is I want to study that without a bias. Even within wireless, people say it has to be cellular, it can't be Wi-Fi. People will say community anchor institution connectivity through schools and libraries isn't meaningful. Our approach is really to take all of that without a preconception or a notion of which one's going to be successful, and let the data do the talking, because we really need to validate it. Because for these community anchor institutions, the alternative is not a 3G or 4G connection. Really, the alternative is no connectivity whatsoever. And figuring out what's viable in these different environments, wireless, I think, will prove itself out in an important way. But even where we see, for example, the Wi-Fi solutions, there's a great opportunity for where commercial paid cellular works out. Well, we don't have to spend the effort and the money. Well, we should understand where that exists too, and let the normal private providers fix that problem.
And just to add one last piece on fiber, there is a lot of fiber optic infrastructure. However, the cost of that infrastructure to operators remains a critical barrier. And I think this relates to a point that Manu brought up earlier, is the notion that fiber is infrastructure. It's not a toll road, and it shouldn't be treated as a toll road. It should be treated the same way we treat investments in dams and roads and railways. We want as many people rolling over those that infrastructure, because that's what creates social and economic development. And looking at the investment strategies and how pricing happens on fiber networks is something that could really unlock things for operators and for
So let me add a concrete data point to what you just said. So in Rwanda, as happens in a lot of countries, one company bought up most of the towers, so they kind of have a monopoly. And there's one fiber, which is in a company that's 51% owned by SK and 49% by the government. But it's a monopoly. So to connect our rural site, I go microwave to a tower. I have to pay $450 a month to put the radio in the tower. And at the base of the tower, there's fiber. I pay $200 per month per megabit per second. Okay, now remember, my consumers are spending $1 a month. That's $650 right there. That's more than I pay for all my costs in Vermont. It's ridiculous. And so it's not the availability of fiber. It's the pricings and the sort of de facto monopoly rents that's the problem.
And Dave, you talked about Project Axios and premised on the idea that community hotspots are becoming a really effective way of making sure that connectivity gets to people where they are. Mm-hmm. How do you see that scaling over time, and where do you see the commercial operators playing into that strategy?
Okay. Well, I definitely think that that's the model that has been most successful for Axios, is putting the hotspots usually in conjunction with either the educational institutions in the community or just in a sort of social gathering spot. And so that's the model they have proven out. They have, in some spots, well, I mean, you can look at their daily statistics, and they have, over 100,000 people connect each day. Some of the hotspots, they have concurrent users in the 300 to 400 range. So they're definitely seeing the usage where they've put the coverage so far. And they definitely plan to replicate that in new areas that they're expanding into Eastern Cape and other areas. So yeah, I think that's proven itself very well in terms of where they're putting the coverage today. I want to make sure I understood the commercial question. So are you asking, where can commercial operators partner with them in providing that coverage?
Is that something that you're looking at?
Not at this point. I would say this is really a government led initiative through Axios, and so there's been just some sensitivities to the commercial participation. Shawana is looking at perhaps a commercial sponsorship for people who want to go above the base level access, but that's the only sort of corporate involvement that I'm aware of at this time.
And I have one more question before opening it up to, oh, sorry, did you have one more thing?
Well, one thing they may look at, though, is also sort of making it available as a wholesale service for operators, so for operator subscribers to utilize sort of in a Wi-Fi version of the model that Vanu was describing with the GSM service. And that would just enable subsidization of the build-out of the model. But there would still be the sort of free service for the citizens, but subscriber use might be in parallel to that.
And my last question before opening it up to the audience would be, given the importance of unlicensed spectrum in all the projects, or a lot of the projects that you guys are working on, the FCC obviously has made a lot of progress in trying to free up more spectrum for unlicensed uses, including in the incentive auction that's concluding shortly. What would you ask the FCC in the US and other regulators around the country or around the globe, what are you suggesting to them in terms of that issue and making sure that more spectrum is made available, not just in the US, but everywhere, in order to make those kinds of services more ubiquitous?
So we have a really good example. And in fact, what I'm telling the other governments we're working with is they should emulate some of the things the US has already put in place. So, and this is actually more on the licensed spectrum side, because if we're running cellular, we need to run on licensed spectrum. So in Vermont, we actually struck a secondary markets deal with Sprint, right? Because they're not using their spectrum in Vermont. So we have a lease from them of 20 megahertz of spectrum in these areas, and we provide coverage for them. And it's a much better way. So the spectrum's there, it's unused. Now there can be some economic mechanism to get it utilized. And a lot of, US was really the leader in this, and other countries are slowly following. That's a great thing to be able to do, where you can lease, loan, lend, sell spectrum. So if you're unusing it, you can unlock the potential and people can use it. However, I will say I really like the model that Steve talked about in Mexico, where they set aside spectrum for entrepreneurs, because even though the spectrum's unused, sometimes carriers are unwilling to part with it because it's a really valuable asset. And if it sits there on the books doing nothing, it just appreciates. So there has to be an incentive to use it.
That's the example in Rhizomatica. It's not just they set aside it for entrepreneurs. They've actually given in Oaxaca, they've given them a license. They're actually a licensed user of the community networking community, and they have a paid Wi-Fi model, so it's not just pure openness. The interesting question is, we really talk about unlicensed and open access spectrum. We're having a problem in the US and other places of interference, which is, for example, in the original 2.5 gigahertz band, microwave ovens that are badly shielded actually bleed into there, and they don't behave well. But the other problem is if it's really open access, you can do anything you want. Well, Bluetooth is there, cell phone, the cordless phones are there, and if they don't actually use the same collision control, you actually have problems. And what you're seeing in the LTE unlicensed movement is that if it's really open, you'll see licensed users who see a big swath of spectrum move it over. And actually, I'm working with an engineering and economics professor who's jointly appointed with models to actually understand that there actually is some math you can do to talk about moving both licensed and unlicensed in proportion. That if you just throw unlicensed at it, what you'll do is you'll move uses from licensed to unlicensed, and in fact, you can actually make the congestion worse. And so it's a trickier thing than a lot of people think, which is just throwing at it a lot of more unlicensed spectrum at it, and that thinking through how to do it is really critical to making sure it works to achieve the goals we want.
Yeah, I would just, I'm glad you brought up sort of the unlicensed LTE topic, because Wi-Fi traditionally operates in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, and in 5 gigahertz we now have other services that are coming into the band besides Wi-Fi, and so some of the 3GPP initiatives to bring LTE or augment the sort of licensed capacity with the unlicensed spectrum capacity as well. So that'll be contending with Wi-Fi and 5 gigahertz. So I do feel it's important that regulators look at expanding the amount of spectrum that is available for unlicensed. I certainly agree we also need to look at cellular-oriented spectrum and making that more accessible, either through initiatives like in Oaxaca, or again through what the U.S. is doing with the CBRS program, which would provide for an opportunity. It's a tiered model, so you got the incumbents, and then there's a sort of licensed tier, and then at the bottom is an opportunistic tier. If it's not being utilized, you can use it sort of like unlicensed. So I'm hoping other regulators will look at that model as well. But again, I think there is a concern. 5 gigahertz is the future of Wi-Fi, but other technologies are moving in there. So we will need more spectrum made available for unlicensed in the future.
Plus 5G over the top now.
Over the top as well, yeah.
So just one quick last point, and that is, I think the one thing we can guarantee is we're going to be surprised by technology, and so we need regulatory frameworks that are better at coping with surprises. So to move away from monolithic strategies for regulation to a more diversified approach that embraces different approaches to spectrum regulation, and then poises us to reinforce success.
Agreed. Ones that can react to where the market, succeeds.
I think we'll open it up to the audience. I think we have one question or a comment right here. Okay, and also when before you speak, can you please identify yourself and the organization that you're with?
David Wilcox, Reach Scale. So 3 data points. We don't have a single continentally scaled social enterprise after 30 years. We're not applying open innovation to countries. We're not actually looking how many of the most innovative models countries have and then creating an ability to import the models they don't have, which will generally be the majority. And when we put electricity and wireless into most locations, I tend to be reminded of the book called Hope is Not a Strategy. So if we went to countries, I'm curious, do you find governments who've already selected a set of scaling enterprises that are already working in these countries on the actual end result, be it connecting artisans to a 1 million-person network, or connecting their health care, or connecting education, putting Wi-Fi into the 53,000 single-teacher schools that the most scaled education organization in the world runs in India? Do you find governments doing that? And if you don't, do you tell them they should be doing that? And are you interested in having that kind of engagement with the scaling organizations that are actually able to deliver the results that the connectivity promises?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it as much in the governments, but everywhere we go, you see lots of organizations trying to do many of the things that you talked about. And I guess it's a little self-serving, but all of them say, well, our problem is we don't have connectivity. So My approach is let's partner. You know, I was talking with an off-grid electric company that puts in solar panels on homes, and then with mobile money, you can buy 6 hours of power for your house. Well, they can't build where there's no connectivity. I said, look, tell me where you'd like to build. I can build coverage. Now I have users there, and you have a business there, and we could leverage that across all those different sectors. And I think there needs to be a coordinating function there so that we're not building here and they're trying to build there, and we know where we're going. If we all go together, I think you can really uplift a community very quickly.
And actually, Google Fiber has created a new paradigm about how to work with governments. Is they use a business strategy called gamification. They essentially said, we're giving away a network. Who wants to make it easy for us? And it's spectacularly successful. And it's a model that's now moved to the whole industry because cities used to think of this as a chance to get money, rents. Yep. And now they've changed it where they're saying, we're partners. We're building something that we're going to work together that's not going to show up that way. This shows up in Rhizomatica in Oaxaca. One of the requirements they have, they're trying to build out 2,500 villages. They look for broad-based support from the local community. And those are the ones who get it first. And it really makes the community get organized and decide whether to do it. And in fact, once those success models get validated, the laggards kind of get bumped along and say, well, what are you doing? The other beautiful thing about this is I actually think these initiatives work better at the municipal level. When you start talking about larger governments, in India, in the ministry, you have to get 7 levels of approval. And that's default. And the reason it's so hard to root out is because you have to pay something to somebody at each level. And it makes it very, very difficult to do business. People are going around that and going to the local level just to get that activated. And to put a plug, actually what's interesting is Commissioner Pai in the US is launching something called the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee to look at, even in the US, what are the local obstacles in terms of rights of way and licensing and all of this, and is there something a government that wants to take some of that airbrush out of the way can do? And the hope is we can create some models here about really unleashing the local potential, because those are the people who really benefit from it.
Most of the organizations I'm talking about have actually already either solved that problem with the government, or, for example, the 53,000 school organization doesn't deal with the government at all. Most important decision they made, never deal with the government. They're in 53,000 villages.
Any other questions or comments or asks? Right over here, I think.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. What experience have you had of getting together meetings online of donors and users and communities and getting an economic consensus of what people want to do and getting the money together?
Well, there is a burgeoning community around this. This example is one. The IEEE, who Manu rightly called out, is doing semi-annual meetings where they're actually set up separate work streams. It's now matured to the point where they're actually looking for project leads on each of the work streams. The World Economic Forum is convening an aspect of these, and the Internet Governance Forum also does. So we actually see them come together, and we're trying not to reinvent the wheel. What we discover is the large-scale meetings actually help in the beginning, but in the end, someone who's got the bandwidth and the interest has to pick up the rope and start towing it. And there's just no getting around it. And what you'll find is that the top-level talk has a certain convening function in the beginning, and at the end, once some work has been done to get people to leverage in. But I find that it's being really pushed forward by a handful of people, not by large convening groups who are willing to step up to the plate and do what's necessary.
Just to add to that, I think the dominant narrative from about 2005 to 2015, say roughly, has been, well, mobile has solved this. Mobile has solved the problem. So, from a development perspective, it's largely been ignored because, well, it turned out the industry fixed the problem. And I think we're recognizing now the limitations of that, and what we're seeing is more interest and awareness in actually, going beyond and connecting everyone. As, of course, it becomes an increasingly big priority to be connected to.
I think we have time for maybe one more. If there is one. Oh, there's one way back there. I thought I saw a hand. Oh, sorry, Megan. Sure.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Rajendra Singh from World Bank. We are working on various initiatives in different parts of the world. one question which we are facing, this is relating to optical fiber. There is a tremendous capacity in the system today because of technological developments, DWDM and this thing. So the issue is, let's say from point A to point B, if we have one single fiber which is capable of carrying the whole traffic of region and the country, or should we build multiple optical fiber cables? Because the issue of competition, regulation, on other hand, the capacity in terms of technological development. What is the best decision? How we should take it forward? Because we are facing challenges on both sides. Thank you.
So thank you for that very tricky question. So I think on the one hand, we need to diversify ownership in these cables. I think the investment in these cables tends to be limited to a few large players. And I think some of the models that have been used, for instance, the World Bank's approach with the Easy Cable, where they created a special purpose vehicle within that to allow smaller players to get on board. I think what holds back operators, certainly what I've seen, is that they're held to ransom by the backhaul costs. And if they can go from becoming renters to landowners on that capacity, I think that could be transformative. I'd like to say we only just need one cable because there's such huge capacity, but what we've also seen is that diversity of investment in more than one cable has proven good for competition. So it's complicated. And also there's the issue of redundancy, that as we depend on fiber optic infrastructure, we actually need redundancy. It's not enough just to have one cable.
So I would say that the answer is context dependent. I mean, there's no simple answer to that question. There are places where there's only enough volume really to support a single cable. And in fact, some of the countries we're studying, the islands in the middle of the Pacific, there's not even enough capacity to support a single cable. They're looking at satellite and they're never getting fixed. And so there are other places where, from the World Bank, where you invest another cable, you have to look at the underlying economics and see what it'll support. I can say on the regulatory side, the biggest problem is people using licensing to stifle financially viable entry. Particularly on undersea landing cables, landing points, countries use that licensing capability in a vicious sort of way to protect incumbents. And if that's the case, I can't see any reason for stopping a company that wants to make the investment from doing it on a regulatory side. And I think that's a reform that we can do that would help. But whether you decide as the World Bank to invest in a particular cable or not, separate from the regulatory aspect, is something you have to do the analysis and to see how the math works out.
And I'll say we suffer from lack of competition in fiber access. And I'm just not confident that we can regulate our way out of that problem and that we actually need multiple competitors to help.
Megan, did you have a comment?
If I'm on. The point you made about people, what was the line, people make networks? What was at the very end of your slide? Many people, what was it?
The internet is made of people.
The internet is made of people. And so what was so great, I mean, how hopeful was everything you guys just said? And the Vermont work, South Africa work, just across the board, getting in the data side and just focusing on the actual guts of the fiber and that. And so the point that in the question, like using our network to share what's working, and who's already got solutions, and then helping governments. Not, it's exhausting to admire the problem, and these poor governments, right? And like we could show up and say, "Have you seen this? Have you seen this? Have you seen this?" Asks and offers, right? And then suddenly, if you know that something actually worked, like Chattanooga, high-speed internet, what did they do? What did so-and-so do? It's a really interesting thing. So back to the point of the open sharing, that we were talking about. What can we use? Can we use the internet itself to much more rapidly share with each other and have unions know that? And so we call it scout and scale. And almost like you're a venture capitalist and you just venture catalyze ourselves. And the one that's so striking to me as we all, the work that's happening and the controversy around DDoB, there's an internet solution that Microsoft and others put into that with white spaces and getting a POP there. And so people in Dadaab actually have internet connectivity in a way that no other refugee camps have. And people are often stuck in a refugee camp for 12 years. Children grow up there. And so if Dadaab did that, and I reflected often, Secretary Kerry talking about Dadaab and how happy we are about it, and in this one aspect that was hopeful. Why is every refugee camp not Scout and Scaled and stolen that idea? And it's because we're not talking to each other at the hopeful way. And so I want everyone in this room to really feel hopeful about what we could do if we actually spoke with each other. Use simple wiki to tell each other whatever we do. So thank you so much for everything you have already catalyzed.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks to the panel and to Kim for moderating. So I have a challenge for all of you, which is to get food and come back within 15 minutes. There is just outside a buffet of sandwiches and salads and things, but please just let's be back, within 15 minutes. There's restrooms to the right as you come out, to the right and then to the left, against the back wall, way back there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.